Hi, everybody. First of all, that's Lynn to my left, and she is one of the leading astrologers in the world, and also one of my best friends. I am so excited about this class, and I love teaching with Lynn. It is a privilege, a pleasure, and just enjoyable as all get out. This class, being swallowed by the dragon, is largely Lynn's creation, so I am supporting her genius in this. But it's my pleasure to do this because it overlaps with themes that I have taught in my own way, which is how to travel through chaos and how to explain what is going on in this profound era of transformation that we are going through. And Lynn's perspective is one of the celestial magnitude. And so I am going to turn it over to her, and I will join her at the end of an hour, and then we will continue our discussion from there.
Yes, thank you so much, Carolyn. All right, being swallowed by the dragon. I think it's clear to everyone living through this time that there are these forces all around us that seem to function like a vortex. We're being pulled, we see the solid ground of the world around us being ebbed away, eaten away by crazy things, by psychic attitudes. We see people we love, people we know, being possessed and taken over by things we would never have imagined. We look at people and say, "Do you really think that?" And they could say the same of us, of course. So one of the things that is going on is it seems as though the old way of relating to each other has been replaced by very powerful forces pulling us across in a direction that no one imagined we would really go in. And I think, watching current events or watching the recap of things that happened in 2021, in early 2021 in the US, which have been very much present in the past few days, is we're seeing something, well, actually watching things happen where a crowd or an individual acts in a way they wouldn't normally act. So, what is happening to all of us? One way you can think about this is that we've entered a period of a very powerful evolution where we have to encounter aspects of the self that work against consciousness. And this particular cycle is always activated at times where something has to die. And we need to choose what we will take with us, what will be absolutely of most fundamental value in the next cycle. Now, a lot of what is happening is connected to the cycle of the eclipse. Some of you will have seen this in the pre-class interview that Carolyn and I had. Could we put up that first slide, Vince? Okay, now when we look at the eclipses, if we were to step back, as if we were looking from way outside the Earth, if we were looking from the moon or from Mars, and we looked at the Earth, and we had time slowed way down, one of the things we would see is that the shadows shaped by the eclipses take this form. And this is perhaps, now what I have to say is eclipse cycles are 19 years long. One particular cycle comes back every 19 years at the same time. So the one we're looking at right now is the one that activates Taurus and Scorpio in the tropical zodiac. And this is the way they look. Imagine that's the planet Earth right there. Of course, this is a mystical image. It's an image of the serpent on top of the egg, around the egg. It's this image of something being put under enormous pressure. And what will emerge? What will come out of it? So, one of the things that's important about this time is that we're going through something collectively. We're also going through the same process on an individual level. So you might want to begin to think right now, what is pulling, what is roiling up, what is under pressure in your life? What are the attitudes in your own psyche, in your own emotions, in the world around you? What are the attitudes that are actually creating huge pressure or movement? Now, the quote on that slide is a quote from Louise von Franz. She said, "There is a secret inner norm of how much of the shadow a human being can stand. It is unhealthy not to see it, but just as unhealthy to take too much of it." Thank you, Vince. I love the way you bring that in and out. So again, there's a secret inner norm of how much we can see at a given time. So I think one of the things that's happened since 2020, in 2020, we had an extraordinary coming together of Saturn and Pluto. It's a conjunction that happens every 35 years, 38 years sometimes. But this time it was in fact conjunct the nodal cycle. And just after the conjunction happened, within days of the conjunction, we had the COVID outbreak. Just after the conjunction happened, two other planets, Jupiter and Mars, joined the conjunction. This is a very, very rare occurrence. And what we all know is that the world has been dismantled since this time. Now, Pluto is the modern ruler of the sign of Scorpio. So we can see that this process of dismantling, this process of something no longer functioning in the way we're used to, the still point that we all had to experience. Sometime after March of 2020, almost all of us had to go in to a containment, a closure, a withdrawal from the world, and everything came to a stop. I mean, people talked about it, people celebrated it. Look, we can hear the birds again. There's no more cars. Look how quiet the world has gotten. But in fact, while in the beginning there was something marvelous to this, there's also been this fear, this anxiety, this deep dread, this craziness that the human animal, we're animals, we're humans, we're divine. We have all of these elements within our nature. But there is something very disturbing, very profoundly shaken in our sense of security. And as the nodes moved into Scorpio earlier this year in late December or early January, depending on which system you're using, the nodes moved into Taurus and Scorpio. They always go backwards through the zodiac. And the south node is like the tail of the dragon. You can imagine the tail, a huge reptilian, a huge sea monster tail. That's another way of thinking about it. That is stirring up the waters, that's stirring up all the sludge. Everything that's been undisturbed for many, many cycles is actually kind of roiled up and spinning around within the larger container of the collective. Now, as this happens, people get filled with very, very strong emotions, very strong impulses. Now, some of this has, as I said, was connected to an earlier cycle that happened in 2020. There's a lot going on there, so I'm not going to tell you about all of it. But what's begun since January is almost as though as we come to a period where we think, oh, we're free. Of course, we've thought that several times. Look, we're free. No, we're not. Look, here it is again. No, it's not. Just as we were getting over, a new thing comes. And there is only so much of this, only so much of the shadow. There's a norm, there's a certain amount of the shadow that we can actually take in without it becoming almost impossible to digest. And this may explain why there are so many, whereas there's a explosion of violence or of crime in cities all over the United States. I just came back from Seattle, and at one point I went to the downtown of this wonderful city. I went to the art museum, which is absolutely extraordinary. And then when I walked out on the streets, it was like, it was scary. It was as if the dark had taken over the heart of the city. Um, and something very similar happened where I live in Paris after last year, after the second lockdown. Crack addicts appeared in my neighborhood. They hadn't been here before. And a neighborhood association had to come in and to, um, uh, get the administration of the city government to do something about it. And it was very quickly taken care of. But it was as if when the normal structure of things, the normal way of interacting stopped, all the shadow elements came to the fore. Now, for most of us, we had routines, we had exercise, we had groups we talked to, we meditated, we had people we spent time with. But over time, more and more and more things started to happen. And people who could not handle what was coming up couldn't contain themselves anymore, apparently. Um, so rather than creating, rather than what was initially a still point, which felt welcome in some of our lives, which felt calming, centering, um, strange as well, because there were things we couldn't do or couldn't see. But now we're in this aspect where the tail of the sea dragon has brought everything up. While I was working on this talk, I ran across an article by a colleague of mine in Australia named Brian Clark, a wonderful astrologer. And he wrote an article on the dragon, and he's someone I'm often twinned with. We often work on the same subjects. But there's a quote I wanted to give you from him. He said, "The nodes of the moon present us with the mythic task of understanding this aspect of our fate. What is the inner dragon that tries to devour solar creativity and identity? What is the inner dragon that's rising, that's trying to devour something?" Now, I think everyone is experiencing this at a certain point. The inner dragons can be rage, they can be terror, they can be a need to have absolute power because we've lost control of our lives and we've lost control of the world. But again, this is a very important question I have for you today. What is the inner dragon that is trying to devour solar creativity? Um, the dragons, now I want to step back. What Brian is referring to here is that the nodes of the moon are actually very rarely visible. They're called invisible planets in Hindu astrology, shadow planets. And whatever they touch, they tend to turn to shadow. They tend to empty out. So the nodal axis moving particularly into Scorpio, which is a sign where we let go of and release that which is no longer viable, that which is no longer helping us be the most creative or the most viable we can be. But it comes in psychic forms that can overwhelm us. We can be overwhelmed. Now, mostly, I think for most of us, we're identifying this as something external, as a danger to um, the security, the stability of the world that we are in. And, obviously, the most egregious aspect of this is the invasion of one country's territory by another aggressor state, and the attempt to not just to swallow, but to, in certain instances, and obviously not everywhere, but to destroy hospitals, to destroy schools, to destroy infrastructures, and in fact to use an unlimited power to actually do to take human life just because you can take it. And it's shocking. It's been extremely shocking to witness this actual manifestation of this destructive force, which we're encountering in um, a particular place in the planet. And we can also see it happening in other places where a hypnotic mindset has taken over and people seem to believe in things that are actually seem mad from another point of view. That people are taken over by repetitive hypnotic beliefs that don't have a basis in fact or in real experience. And so we can see very clearly the manifestation of the dragon in the world around us. And where I would ask you um, to look inside for a moment and to see what is it. All of us are being asked to take one aspect of our own psyche, to take one aspect and to push it, to see it wake up in us as if it could suddenly devour us. It's like you have a little goldfish, and the goldfish turns out to be a piranha. You're feeding it, and suddenly it has teeth. And this happens to all of us at times. Somebody steps on our territory in the wrong way, says something to us, directs aggression at us, and suddenly the an energy that we cannot contain arises. Right now, even if you are not feeling this energy yourself, you're certainly noticing it in the world around you. So when I was talking about Seattle being in the center of the city, it had just been. I said to the person sitting next to me on the plane, it was like being in an outdoor insane asylum. So what happens? It's as if rather than having the center cities of our childhood, there's like everything that cannot stay. The people who are in deep distress, who have lost their homes, who have substance abuse problems, people who have no place to go, who are suffering from psychological disconnection. There's almost been a giving over of the center to um, a great suffering, but that at the same time, what does that say about what we are building at the heart of our cities, what we are building at the center of our world? There's a what is in danger here? One of the original myths of the dragon is Tiamat. Tiamat comes from Akkadian Middle Eastern philosophy, part of the Mesopotamian series of civilizations. And she represented primal chaos. And through the waters, through the merging of different waters, the world came into being, different places, different aspects of life. And then when the original creator gods, the children of Tiamat and her husband, came into being, they were thinking of overthrowing and killing their father. And Tiamat, uh, uh, the father went to battle and he was killed, the mate of Tiamat, the original chaotic watery form, and she became filled with extraordinary rage at the destruction of the world and took the form of a sea monster that came out and devoured everything, devoured the world, destroyed not just those who had gone against the old word, but destroyed everything. Now, this is a little bit what we are experiencing right now, what we're seeing at work in the world. So how do we work with the dragon, and how does it work in our own charts? Can you show the next slide? Okay, can we make that a little larger? Yeah. Now, the nodes of the moon in Hindu mythology and in Hindu astrology are called Rahu and Ketu. And Rahu is the head of a demon. Okay, it could be a demon which has a twisty tail, and Ketu is the other half, the tail. So we call this the tail of the serpent, the tail of the dragon. This is how these have been spoken of for millennia in different cultures. And in Hindu mythology, Rahu was one of the demons who helped the gods churn the world into being. Now, as Rahu, uh, and the gods needed the demons, they couldn't create the world on their own. They needed both light and dark. They needed the power without the power of the other side, without the shadow side. And again, some say it's the gods who called the demons, but maybe they weren't. Maybe they were just different. But in any case, once the world, the nectar, had been churned into being, the divine nectar, the world was being churned into being, but there was also the creation of a nectar which would give immortality. The gods, were gathering it to drink it, but one of the demons sensed something wasn't quite right and snuck in to the inner sanctum of the gods, and the sun saw the demon and told Surya, one of the gods, who came out and cut the demon right in two, took his sword and separated his head from his body. Except there was a problem. The demon had seen a few drops of nectar, of the nectar of immortality, which had fallen on the floor, and he sucked them up, licked up the drops, and therefore he could not die. But he lived in a state of permanent separation into different states of consciousness. Now, for the Hindus, the tail of the dragon, Ketu, the south node, which is in Scorpio in the tropical zodiac right now, it can only empty out. If you think of a body cut in two, it doesn't have a mouth, so it can't take in any more nourishment. But Ketu, the tail, can continue to empty and can just empty out. So when this south node of the dragon is going through a part of your chart, when it's going through a particular chart, it is emptying out that sign. But as it does, you could say it's emptying out, it's reactivating very ancient, very old patterns. Again, the emptying out, you can't help but think of excrement. You think of what has to be eliminated, both from the body and the psyche. So K2 is always about those things. The south node is always about those things that can never be gathered back, that can never, you can't take in new material, but the old can come up and seize you. The old can come up and possess you. The old can come up and devour you. Now, the head of the dragon, Rahu, is seen as hungry, insatiable, and also insubstantial, so always trying to do more. In most of Western astrology, the North Node is seen a little bit differently. It's seen as the need to pull out of an insatiable grasping hunger into a form of consciousness about what we really want, where we're really going. And the North Node right now is in Taurus. Taurus being the life-giving sign, the sign where all the flowers begin to open and the birds sing and new life returns in, not just at the beginning, not just the first premise of it, but in the full sensuality and the fullness of being. So we have very clear instructions right now about where we are meant to bring our attention. Now, one of the extraordinary things about doing the class on these dates, which Carolyn came and proposed to me, is that on June 16th, which is tomorrow morning, my time, and probably early morning for the time most of you are listening to this in the States, is the planet Venus will come and make an exact encounter with the North Node. And this is a lot of what we'll be talking about tomorrow, is how do we follow, how do we become conscious of where our heart moves us? And how does that become a much stronger motor, a much stronger directional system, a much stronger inner guide than these very scary impulses, than these very large, accented, um, overwhelming aspects of our collective emotional system, which are constantly being pushed into rage or fear or anger. And the thing is what is leaving our world has to leave right now. But we can make the wrong decision and try to swallow what does not belong to us. And we can see this, other people, other entities, other groups doing this. And this, the very violent impulse, the Scorpio is traditionally the sign of death. And for those of you who are Scorpios who are listening to this, please know that this is part of the archetypal range of the sign. But most of you will know that within this archetype that may touch uh, death, there is also a very powerful urge to create and to maintain and to continue life in some form. It's when it goes in the negative spiral that it becomes only something that cannot be renewed. Now, with the nodes, the nodes create two very important moments in the year, and they become visible only during eclipses. In fact, the nodes are the shadows that we see on the sun or on the moon. That is what the nodes are. And in fact, the nodes don't have a real physical existence. They really are about this moment when the moon and the sun are perfectly aligned with the earth, moving from south to north. And at that moment, if there's a new or full moon at that moment, we see the shadows appear. Okay? And we see this process of light being overwhelmed. In Hindu mythology, can we go back to that slide again, Vince? In Hindu mythology, when the demon was cut in two, he swore vengeance on the sun and the moon. And this is the origin of the of the eclipse cycle, twice, several times a year, the demon gets close and almost manages to swallow the luminaries, but just can't quite do it. But this was always seen in almost every culture in the world, in the indigenous mind. The shadow appearing on the moon, the blood red veil appearing on the moon, as it did last month. Some of you here listening may have seen the eclipse that happened on May 16th. And I know many people, a friend of Carolyn and I, who we often taught with at Chart, lost her husband. That eclipse touched her chart and her husband's chart very strongly. And the eclipse sometimes is very literal. Sometimes it means it is time. This energy will be taken. It doesn't mean that we want this to happen always, but it behooves all of us. All of us are asked to go very deeply inside and see what it is that we don't need at this moment. The past weeks, if you know, for those of you who follow the stock market, I think the past few days, you've been seeing things being emptied out, and you can see this cycle comes. There's an emptying out of what has seemed to be, we know how much things are worth. We know how much things cost. We know a little bit. We have an anticipation of what we're going to need every month. And the South Node in Scorpio suddenly is like being on a roller coaster where everything intensifies and deepens. And so some of our value on a very literal level is being taken through the tail of the dragon, through the tail of the serpent, and being emptied out, and it is not going to come back. Okay. Now, what in your life are you being asked to let go of right now? What in your life is no longer viable? Where is, and one of the very difficult things about this is this experience of not being able to control what's happening. I was reading something this morning. Taurus, where the North Node is very much about what we have, what belongs to us, what belongs to us that we identify deeply with. And this morning I was reading a story about a Muslim family in India whose the patriarch of the family was accused of stirring up anti-government sentiment. And 2 days later, the government came in with a bulldozer and razed the house. They didn't even say, we're going to knock your house down. The pretext was that it had been built without the legal permits 40 years ago. But actually, they didn't even give advance warning. They just came in and all the belongings, there's just a pile of rubble. And this happened to 3. So imagine, this is the South Node in Scorpio, which is suddenly, you're not doing things the way we want to. This is what's going to happen to you. This is suddenly everything. It's unimaginable, this notion, just because you can, that you go in and take something or destroy something that actually represented the stability and the well-being of someone you don't like. This, and of course, we've seen other examples almost too horrendous to mention recently, about how everything suddenly that we expect to be there. I mean, that image really struck me this morning because I'm thinking about this theme, that you go home and there's no there there. There's no there there. So we can see that this is happening in many places in our lives. Now, as I said, May 16th was the last full moon eclipse, and it was visible in the United States. Um, but because tomorrow we have a north node activation, we have an activate. Not only is Venus going to conjunct the north node, but it's the ruler of the sign of Taurus. And one of that things that means in the archetypal language is that there is a coming home. It's like a connection. It's a connection to um, the center of everything we most desire. Now, many of us don't know what our deepest desire is. But if during tonight, before tomorrow's class, I would invite you all, those of you who are watching this live, or who see this before tomorrow, I would invite all of you to step in and watch this. Call in your heart's desire. This is something that we're going to be working with tomorrow. Where just let that be an invitation, a door opening in your heart that will take place on the East Coast of the United States. It'll be about 5:30 in the morning. In the West Coast, it'll be it'll be quite a bit earlier, or 3 in the morning. So for your dream life. But just remember to issue the invitation to yourself. And then tomorrow we'll look at what's emerging from that inner process. I want to go back, though, to this process of the nodal axis. Can you put up the next slide, please? Right. So this is one cycle of eclipses. And one of the things you're seeing here are the shadows that this is a solar eclipse, okay? Because a lunar eclipse will cover half the globe. At any given moment, there are 2 lunar eclipses every year, not in each sign of the node, so one in Taurus, one in Scorpio. But they'll be seen by about half the planet. But solar eclipses are very, very different. You read about people who go hunting these too. You'll remember that in 2017, there was an eclipse that was visible across the United States. And I knew people who drove to be able to see it and hung out with great crowds. And I knew others who didn't leave their house that day because they are like, I'm not going to take in that energy. But this is one of the series of eclipses that travels across the globe. And as you can see, the eclipses come in from this particular eclipse comes in from the South Pole. And in the beginning, you could only see these eclipses in Tierra del Fuego or Madagascar or somewhere in the southern hemisphere. And then as the eclipse cycle repeats over time, every 19 years, every 18.6 years, actually, you have, they move geographically and cover the planet. But do you see how clearly this corresponds to that image of the serpent wrapped around the egg, the image of the serpent wrapped around the earth? This is something very similar. Now, what's really mysterious for me is, how did the ancient civilizations see this? How did they know this? It's pretty mind-boggling. We have, satellites that actually shoot us pictures of the Earth all over the planet. We can create maps with computers ahead of time that will show us the eclipse path. But ancient civilizations already knew this was going on. And yet what we can see is an eclipse would repeat only this is a little bit technical, but there's a difference between the Saros series, which is the same eclipse that happens in a different place each time, and a 19-year cycle where another eclipse series will be in the same place geographically, in the same part of the zodiac, and you can see it again if you know it's coming. So how did you had to, first of all, think in very large cycles, which is something we already have time doing. We have trouble thinking in more than 19-month cycles, let alone 19-year cycles. So can we put up the next slide, please? Okay. I want to run you through a little bit of previous cycles where the North Node was in Taurus and therefore the South Node was in Scorpio. And I went back, I've looked at this before, in 1920, in the period between 1928 and 1930, what happened? We have actually a kind of extreme buildup of wealth and then a complete loss of wealth that had been built up in the middle of this period, in the middle of the cycle where the nodes were going through Taurus. And again, they moved backwards from the end of the sign to the beginning of the sign. We had the 1929, the famous 1929 stock market crash that wiped people out, and the initiation into a period of Great Depression. Again, this notion that what had been solid, what had been there, what had been available, was no longer, everything changed. And at that time, it was economic. Okay. In 1947 and 1949, let's go to the next slide because I talk about this here. Okay. What you have is possession, ownership. These are all things that have to do with Taurus, being certain of what belongs to us, and the trauma of things being taken away. So two things happened in this period. Within days of the nodes going into Taurus and Scorpio in August 1947, India and Pakistan declared independence, which is a great thing. They said, this is our land. This belongs to us. But what also happened is that, so the independence of the Indian subcontinent was something that people had worked for a very, very long time. But what happened is there was also what's called partition. And Muslims in India left to go to the new Muslim state of Pakistan. And Hindus in Pakistan were given very little time to take their belongings and go to India. And one of the things that happened is that people in villages sometimes saw this as an opportunity. We're now the dominant ones here, and what you have now belongs to us. So neighbor went against neighbor. There was a kind of collective insanity. And I mean, when you read about this, it's actually horrifying. Again, it's very similar to what we've been seeing in these past few months, whether we've been seeing what happened with the gunmen in Texas or in Buffalo, or what's happening in the Ukraine. So, or again in India with the houses being raised, as I talked about this morning. Now, we don't just, so what happened is that in some villages, people went into hiding and they saw neighbors taken over by kind of monstrous sentiments, possessed, where the person that lived with them, that they talked to every day for 20 years, suddenly became the enemy, and people were murdered, their belongings were stolen. A lot of it had to do with personal belongings being seized. And identity, this whole idea of territory, I will take what is mine, and this no longer belongs to you. This need to, on the one hand, go in the direction of Taurus, which is, this is mine. This is mine. I belong to this. This land belongs to me, which is the creation of the nation states. But on the other hand, on an individual level, the same process, whipping up this sea serpent tail and all the rot at the bottom of the pond. So whether we just suddenly, it's like all of us on a psychic level have had to confront, have had to, I think many people have taken a break. Many people have told me they've taken a break from the media. And they've taken a break from the media. Why? Because these images are almost too much to look at. There was an article in the New Yorker with images of Ukraine and black and white images of what had been left by Russian forces and people lying in the street. And a friend of mine said, "Are you sure it's good to look at these things?" So again, remember what Marie-Louise von Franz said. There's only so much shadow that we can take in without it being detrimental to the psyche. Only you know how much is too much for you. You have this extraordinary ability to put down a kind of an iron grating, to shut the door. Lead protects us from radiation. Okay. And one of the things that's extraordinary with the nodes right now is that they're being squared almost the entire time by a planet called Saturn. And Saturn rules lead. It rules our ability to bring a limit, to find some system of control, some way of saying stop. To Saturn, when it's positive, it reinstates the boundaries that are necessary to maintain the world. It's almost like if you've ever driven through a city where all the traffic lights are out, it's complete chaos. And you're like, when can we put those back? Let's hope they go back in so things can go back to some kind of order again. Now, maybe there are people who don't feel that way, but there's this notion that each of you here knows when something is, we all know that we're in this process, right? Here in Paris, you maybe are hearing my windows go back and forth because we're in the middle of a mini heat wave here. And it's August, temperatures in June. And this is happening in more and more places in the world. In last month, again in India, the temperatures were so hot that birds were falling out of the sky. I mean, something, the world is out of joint. And this was always expressed by Shakespeare during the tragedies. So the South Node in Scorpio brings up this tragic sense of the world. But the North Node in Taurus invites us. It invites us to find a place where where the earth is solid and fertile and green and inviting. There are still many places like this in the world, and most of you will have one near you. We're beyond that. Okay, what is, for those of you who know your astrology chart, it's very important for this course to locate where Scorpio and Taurus are, because these are the areas where the nodes will be sweeping through with the tail, but also with the invitation to consciousness. And this invitation is really important for all of us. Vince, can we go back to the slide with the dates, please? It was the second, not, no, forward. That one. Thank you. Oh, he's so good. So in 1947 and 49, we didn't just have partition of India, but there was also in the world the establishment of the State of Israel and the entire the dislocation of the Palestinians from their land. And that is like the snake swallowing its tail, that situation, that story of rage and pain and loss, and at the same time, finally, the promised land, depending on which side you're looking at it. That story is like the serpent swallowing its tail, and is constantly being reactivated during this particular cycle. And you can go back thousands of years in history and see the cycle activated in Jerusalem. We also had in this period the establishment of, you could say, a certain battle lines in the world, the foundation of the Cold War. Now, when we get to 1966 and 67, you can see what erupted in, I mean, all we have to do is think of this hot town city in the summer. All we have to think of is the music from this period, and to see how much needed to change. Now, in this particular cycle, the nodes were interfacing. There were other planetary cycles. That's what I've written over here. There were other planetary cycles going on. So it wasn't just the nodal axis, but they were heightened with very powerful cosmic forces, both in 1947 and again in 1966, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which lasted for much of the 60s, and which my colleague Rick Tarnas talks about absolutely brilliantly, all the social upheaval. But in the middle of this period, this kind of no, I will not go, I will not do I will not go and destroy people in a faraway country I don't know, or other people saying, if you don't go, you're worthless scum. This polarization and this division of around what really matters. And throughout the world, countries in Africa were in the middle of major independence movements of, again, claiming back what belonged to them. I would say this period in the 60s with the South Node, it was in Scorpio, what were people throwing off a kind of belief system that you had to allow other people to decide for you what your life was worth and what you were going to do with it. Okay, so there's a huge amount of throwing off the old system of power. This is also something that happens in the invitation to the nodes. I want maybe in 2003. In 2003, the United States, just as the nodes entered Taurus, Scorpio, the United States, the South Node in Scorpio, invaded Iraq. Okay. And again, it's this whole idea of territory, of boundary, of what belongs to us, what we want to control and take charge of and clean up. But what came out of that? What is that idea of victory within a matter of weeks or months, and the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein? And then what was born from that? What was the rage? What was the destructive impulse that was born from that taking of a territory, that removing from another people, of what belonged to them. So again, right now, this is going on in cities all over the United States because of issues around rent, issues around affordability, around whether there are houses for people to live in. Do people people can't move because there's no place to move to. There's no alternative. People say, I'll just stay here because I can't find anything better. I can't, even though everything in me wants to change, I can't change right now. So there's this notion of a system of power which is keeping people stuck or actually taking away what they have on one level. That we see activated each time this nodal cycle comes in. Now, the difference, again, with this cycle with some of the earlier ones is that it's coming after these major, major planetary changes that began in 2020 with Saturn, Pluto, and that's mostly experienced through COVID, through the pandemic, and the fear of uh, even in our bodies, we no longer recognize. I was reading something about how the pandemic had changed the behavior of all the other viruses, and like doctors, that like things are happening at the wrong time of year and the wrong order. The medical system doesn't know what to do with this. It's like the whole system of our biology has been upended, and all the signpost, well, it's spring and you have a cough, so it's this virus. It's autumn and you have a cough and it's that virus. The signpost, the solidity of what we are used to seeing in our life have all been pulled out, pulled up. One of the our bodies, our bank accounts, our environment, the economy, whether what we have belongs to us, what we know, what's familiar to us, will be there in the same form. All this is called into question during this entire cycle, which it doesn't end until the nodes will stay in Scorpio and Taurus until July 17th, 2023. But the most intense period is this year. The most powerful period in this cycle is coming. There are a couple of dates coming up, and the most important are probably the end of July, the beginning of August. And the very beginning of November, when there's so many powerful configurations in the sky around the nodal axis that it's almost hard to imagine. At the end of July, the North Node will conjunct Uranus in the sky, and that's July 31st. And on August 1st, Mars will come to the same place and connect to Uranus and to the North Node. And this is Mars and Uranus coming together are always, they can be eruptive, they can be explosive, they can be violent, they can indicate a release, because Uranus can be a planet that releases everything or completely turns it upside down and topsy-turvy. There can be a breakthrough, a breaking through to freedom. It's a very unpredictable and very volatile energy. And Uranus, Mars, and the North Node will all be at the same time. And what it feels like is there's something that's unexpected, a sudden release of energy that maybe could not have been predicted, but that involves many, many people. That isn't uh, uh, just a minor event in one corner of the world. Now, how can we think about this? Because this is, there's a moment again, if you've been swallowed by the dragon, if you're experiencing this, being deep in, being buried, being uh, cooked in there, being boiled in the juices uh, of the dragon's stomach, feeling permanent discomfort of sometimes, feeling some form of permanent psychic or spiritual discomfort, then this is a very powerful moment for breaking free. This is an exceptional moment for finding your way out of something that has possessed you or possessed someone else. Um, Again, the North Node invites the participation of our consciousness. The South Node pulls us in to the old patterns. And it's as if we're spinning, we're running the same story, the same emotion is running us over and over again. And this is a very difficult experience. One of the ways of dealing with you can also think of it as a kind of toxicity, a sort of psychic or spiritual toxicity. And I think it's always easier to see these things in other people than in ourselves. And so one of the ways of working with this is to ask other people, uh, people who you really trust, uh, uh, what if they see that something is off in you. Okay. I have now, if you know where Taurus and Scorpio are in your chart, and we'll be talking about this in other classes, um, you will, the house where Scorpio is, will be a place where you feel the most amount of this pull of psychic toxicity, where the work of emptying out and letting go and not getting caught is most important. And things may leave your life in this area. Now, if you don't know where this is, you can go to a site, astro.com, www.astro.com, where you have the option of creating a free horoscope. And you will need your time of birth. And if you don't have a time, you just use your sun sign. So you use sunrise as your time. And then you will find where Scorpio falls and where Taurus falls. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but this is the way. I think many of you already have this information. And one of the things you're going to be looking at is what area specifically is being acted on. And it is happening to all of us. All of us are going through it somewhere. Carolyn, weren't you about to step in at this junction in time?
Yum, yum, yum. You know, my Venus is in Scorpio, right?
No, your Venus is in Capricorn.
Oh, is that where it is?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank God.
Well, we could pretend it's in Scorpio, if you like.
It was somewhere in the chart, but it's so delicious. And I would like to just jump in with some commentary because you've inspired so many, so much. One is that you made me think about this rise in the militant groups in our country.
Yeah.
That their primary call, there's a professor at Harvard who specializes in teaching about the rise of the militant groups, and I heard her speak the other night. Maybe some of the rest of you have as well. And she was saying how incredibly dangerous this is, but that their common theme is that they believe this land is theirs. And
Right.
they have a right to this land, the whiteness of this land. So this Taurus territorialism. But what I wanted to comment about in terms of this fascinating cycle of the dragon is from another point of view, and that's the pandemic, all the volatile forces that have coalesced at this time. Because the way what I oftentimes begin a class with is the image of a building, and that every floor of a building, and you're the building, and every floor of it is a different view of your own life and a different view of reality within your life. So that at the first floor, you see just the basics and the physicalness of your life. But as you rise up each level, you see a greater view of your own hood. And the higher you go, the less you're attached to the bottom, the less sounds you hear, the less smells. So your five senses break down, and you begin to imagine. Your imagination takes over as you get up the floors in yourself. But it costs a lot more to live on higher floors in any condominium building. Everything, the journey to afford the next level in yourself is very expensive because you have to shed illusions. And as you get up higher and higher, you have to work more with your imagination. You have to work with image. You have to work with archetypes. You have to work with the skills of the soul versus the skills of the five senses that you use to navigate the physical world when you walk out the building. Because you can't walk out of the second floor without hurting yourself. And certainly the fifth floor, you'll kill yourself. So your only contact with your physical life is on your first floor. But as you rise up, you have to, what happens is you have to, the capacity to rise up within yourself is the capacity to shed one way of thinking and employ the other tools that are available with cosmic knowledge, with archetypal knowledge, with symbolic. You have to let go of one way of thinking and you have to go from living in the horizontal world to living in the vertical world, to accessing the hologram, which is where astrological wisdom and knowledge comes in, and archetypal knowledge. So when I listen to you talk about this cycle of the dragon, I immediately think about that it is happening simultaneously with the pandemic and simultaneously with an economic reshuffling that's happening and simultaneously with a global war, because though it's being fought in Ukraine, it is global because it's affecting the world food market. It's affecting baby food. It's affecting everything. It's affecting the global economy. It's affecting the global nuclear thinking. Will in fact, the first thing that occurred to me is, will they finally drop a nuclear weapon when Uranus and Mars go collision? Because
not
it's nuclear power. So all of this kind of explosion. But if I took everybody and said, let's go up another level, let's go up to like the big seats in the house where you lean back and you look at a screen that you rarely, if ever, look at, which is, what is the reason for this from a cosmic point of view, and get out of why it's affecting your life, just life itself. And you looked at, this is a time when we need to have a very different relationship with how we understand the nature of God. We need to shift from having this idea that there is an external off-planet God that's going to sweep in and save us from our own stupidity and foolishness, and get to a place where we realize we're the co-creators of what happens to us. That in order, if I was dealing with one person who's ill, in order for you to heal, you have to recognize how sick you are. And all of that has to be stirred up to come out. What I've understood now in my 30 some years in this is that in order to heal, you have to have all of this come out and look at all of the reptiles, as Teresa of Avila would put it, in order to then determine if you want to heal, if you have the power to transform yourself and deal with all of the combative forces in you that have rendered you so weak. And it is a very difficult choice, But the pandemic has made it a collective choice. And the economy falling has made it a collective choice. And it's as if the forces of the universe are bringing together every single event that brings us to our vulnerability, war, money, illness, everything, as if to say, and what is likely happening is that you have to look at the critical choice for me of this dragon is, will you turn on others or will you turn in yourself? Will you blame others for this and say, oh, well, it's the Democrats, it's the Republicans, it's invaders, it's the poor people, it's the this, it's that, as if that is a solution? Or will you get that this is actually what transformation looks like? We have been braced for a process of transformation for 70 years now. Did you think it was going to happen in a field of flowers? No, it's going to cost us all. It's going to cost everyone. Every one of us is going to go through. We are going through this transformation together. That's what we've been teaching about. That's why it's so important to go through this journey of saying, okay, how do I navigate this? How do I navigate this?
Yeah, I was watching an interview with some Russians who left Russia because they're sickened by the war, and they're showing their passports saying, I wish I had another one.
Right.
I don't know who I am. I don't know what I belong to anymore.
Right.
And see, this is part, you can hear the whole process we're talking about. It's like there is something that is unacceptable here. I cannot turn against other people in order to be myself.
Right. And that's part of the choice. See, that's part of the dragon choices. I can't blame other people. I can't. I was in, well, that's not a story worth telling, but when I hear people pit other people against this, like they have more and it should be mine. This type of thinking, this is exactly what, let me put it in mystical language and in prayer, because this is what makes sense to me. I have long looked at not just prayer, but why prayer and why it is important to pray. And I don't speak as a Catholic. I speak as someone now who is a devout mystic and devoted to prayer and the power of it. And my fascination that all traditions have prayers of protection. And you wonder, like, protection from what? What am I getting protected from? Like demons in the corner kind of thing. But in fact, what we are talking about right now with this dragon going like this is the stirring up of psychic free radicals in the collective. All the dark thoughts, all the dark inclinations. And if you just look at the laws of the universe, energy creates matter. And when you don't protect yourself it's the reason you say to someone, travel safely home. That's a blessing, even if you don't think of it as a blessing. You are blessing that person. You are extending grace to them. And when you enter into prayer and you're saying, hold me, download some grace around me right now, protect me in this field. It doesn't matter that you can't see that light, but light shineth upon you. And that light is a light you cannot generate by yourself. And it activates the laws of cause and effect and magnetic attraction. And you are not attracting. At that point, you cease attracting a quality of dark free radicals that are toxic to you, toxic to you.
Mm.
And what prayer prevents. I remember being with John O'Donohue, and I was going through this time of where I was feeling very resentful about this person that had, stolen from me. It's not a story worth telling. What's worth telling is that I was so resentful, and I couldn't get over that resentment. And that is a type of dragon where you feel like you have been cheated and justice, and you're so just and so fair, and something unfair, and how could it happen? Right? And I had to confront him. And that's an inner dragon, which is your arrogance over this, that. And
Mm.
John O'Donohue said to me, "You're not ready to see him because you are too vulnerable around evil. And it's your arrogance that'll do it." And he didn't use that word, but that's what he was saying in his own lovely way. And that's when the dragon in you will consume you. And he said, you need to pray to have the grace to be around darkness so it doesn't get you. And that's my counsel to people now, as they need to decide, I need to find my values. It's not necessarily something they have ever asked themselves before. They need to reflect upon it. They need grace to reveal upon to them that I might need help to navigate this part of myself, because I need grace, not an intellectual, well, I think this is I need grace. What do you think?
Oh, what you're talking about is something I recognize. It's, sometimes you have all the conditions in your life to be pretty happy, but something happens, like one thing gets stuck in there. There's like a thing, all your consciousness gets obsessed by something, and you keep turning it around, turning it around, turning it around, and you can't be yourself. You can't. I mean, obviously, at moments where you're yourself, but when you leave that state, you realize you've been underperforming. You realize that you've been swallowed by the dragon, and that it was keeping you from actually connecting your higher abilities, your instincts, your intuition, as you talked about with your resentment, or it could talk about your desire to control another person in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Or your certainty that you're the one who should have the power, whatever that happens to be. When you are controlled by that, there's a certain, because those are archetypal impulses as well.
Mm-hmm.
Each person's dragon takes a different form. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the big ones with Scorpio is the power. I have the power to do with you whatever I want.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what we're seeing people do, whether it's shoot people or being militants in the back of a truck where they're arrested, or threatening people because they don't like what they're doing politically. But all of this, I think, is part of a larger chaos, which is this very profound time of transformation. Let me back up and start this again. I think what makes us vulnerable to violence,
Mm.
and vulnerable to the most barbaric time, which is something you and I talked about for years, this age of barbarianism that we are in, obviously, is that it's actually a larger choice point between whether or not we want to transform into a species, like even our bio-spiritual ecology is changing, whether or not we want to transform into a species capable of a consciousness that simply doesn't have the instinct to kill anymore.
Mm.
Or whether we still want to resolve our problems by kill or don't kill, enemy, friend, take, this duality. The dragon represents that duality of right, wrong, mind this, win, lose, that we have to transcend this type of way. We won't live to see this. but we are living to see the corruption of this way, and that this way of life on a planet that is now well populated, that is about to enter the galactic community, that has global problems now, climate change, nuclear weapons, that we celebrate the capacity to destroy ourselves. We celebrate that. That is incompetent. I actually go to bed thinking about that. What the hell is wrong with us that we celebrate the capacity to destroy the only place we live? But I digress. We
But
must.
as you say, on a mystical level, sometimes the dark has to rise.
That's right.
Has to rise to be dealt with because the light can't be born of it otherwise.
Right. And I wish everybody listening to this would grab someone and say, you've got to listen to this class, because you've got to learn from this. You've got to learn to navigate the cosmos with the choices you make in everyday life. You have to understand what's actually going on here, that this isn't a problem of politics, that it's not just, it is a larger journey that we are all on, that will include politics. It will include the finances. It will, because we are shifting. We're on a huge transition that won't end in one political season. It won't end in 1 year. It is a huge transformation that is taking us from one way of being to another, and every choice that every person can make along the way that contributes to becoming a whole being is a contribution to the biospiritual ecology of the whole.
You know, I love so much what you're saying, the biospiritual ecology, because, you know, one of the things I was thinking about looking at those dates, which I know pretty well, is the situation with Israel. You know, Israel born out of the horrors of the Holocaust. So people finally saying, okay, we'll give you this land. But the tail, that taking from the other because you could, getting rid of them, sticking them in camps, what that engendered. Okay, that if something could have happened and everybody could have had what belonged to them, how different would that be? Or were we just not capable of that at that juncture in time? It's our consciousness has to grow so that what we have doesn't come because we've killed somebody else off and gotten rid of them.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. And yet, I think that, let me say, as we bring this first class to a close,
Mm.
that one, that always is the prelude to the next stage of consciousness. People, and this mystifies me, but people will always fight waking up, just like you fight waking up in the morning.
Yeah.
But you fight waking up inside. You fight that, finding out that next level of truth. People turn off the TV. I don't want to know, but they turn off the TV in themselves. They turn off their guidance. And it is astonishing to me. Lynn, when I got into this decades ago, I assumed everybody wanted to be healthy. Everybody wanted to be whole. I mean, what was I thinking? I assumed this, only to find out I was wrong, that in fact, the saboteur is so strong in people that when given a chance to choose truth or choose healing, it is terrifying to people to fill in their fragments, to become whole, to join the collective, to decide, I think I want to understand more about the whole, instead of deciding, instead of judging in the moment, instead of staying negative. I think I'll choose a higher perspective.
Mm.
And the empowerment that comes from that. But what I think people are terrified of is that they might have to empower others. That the love of power eventually must change within them to the power of love.
Yeah.
And that transition is the transformation that we are being asked to make. If I had to put it in another language, that is whether or not you have that in you to actually make choices that empower the whole. And when we go through something like we're going to go through now, that's just begun, it'll bring out the hoarder in people. It'll bring out the tail of their dragon. And this is why tomorrow's class on, wait a minute here, you have really got to lock down your values. You have to actually understand grace, because if you cannot give grace to others, how do you think heaven will work with you?
Mm.
How do you think heaven will work with you? That's me.
Yes, it's kind of, I mean, I probably haven't finished talking about the dragon, but I will ship, especially because of this coincidence of Venus with the North Node tomorrow. It's like this moment of how I know people who, want good things, but they don't, they think, well, I can have this, and why should I bother thinking about other people?
Right, right.
It doesn't, it stays, it's almost like there's a limited bit of vision. It's only for me, right?
But I think that's what people don't get. That holism is about taking your power to the whole.
And what you said, the power, move away from the love of power to the power of love. That is what the Scorpio Taurus axis is about. So I mean, what we're talking about with the nodal axis is one of the many large cosmic cycles going on, but it's a very specific task during this period that goes for another year now, about do we let that tail of the dragon in and come out our mouth, right? Or come out from between our eyes when we look at the rest of the world, because that's really what we're working on, is not doing that. You know what I mean? And it happens way too often.
Yeah, all too often. Well, I want to end this first class on a blessing. I just want, what I want to say to people is, when you feel that dragon, here's your prayer: God, hover over me, give me some grace and fast. And just stay in grace and become mindful of the duality of these forces in you. And that when they surface, pause for a minute, just pause, and just say, I need some grace before I think. I need some grace. And if you think first and act, then ask for some grace to clean up your mess. But just dwell in grace. Thank you, my wondrous friend.
Yeah.
And we'll see you for session 2 tomorrow. Thank you.
See you, everyone.